They said it would be a waste of money at my age. My own daughter said that, standing in the hospital hallway with her arms crossed as if she were the one about to give something away. She canceled my surgery before I could even sign the consent form, as if my body, my life, and my choice had quietly expired without my notice. I remember her words more clearly than the doctor's explanation or the rustle of the paper gown. They were clean, practiced words, meant to sound reasonable. "Mom, you've done enough. We're not risking you for this." But underneath them, I heard what she truly meant. You don't matter that much anymore. I'm 74 now, and I live alone in a one-bedroom apartment above a bakery that opens too early and closes too late. The smell of yeast and coffee has become my clock. I know every phase of their morning rush by sound alone. The rolling carts, the first hiss of the espresso machine, the young barista humming along to a song that was written after my knees began to ache. I like it here. It's small but honest. There's a window that faces west, and in the evenings the light falls across the table where I keep my sewing basket and a half-finished crossword. Sometimes I think I could stay here forever, if only my hands would stop remembering what they were once ready to do. It's strange to think how quietly the world decides when you've outlived your usefulness. No announcement, no ceremony, just smaller invitations, fewer questions, then the slow realization that every conversation about you happens in another room. I should have noticed it sooner, the way Miranda's voice changed when she spoke to me, softer but edged with something managerial, like a nurse pretending patience. For years I mistook that tone for care. It wasn't. It was containment. When Jesse, my grandson, her son, fell ill, it was as though the house lost its sound. No laughter, no television, only the beeping of monitors and the polite language of specialists. I watched him fade from the brightness that once made the entire family revolve around him. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I could trade places with him if someone would let me. That kind of thought only visits grandmothers, the quiet arithmetic of love, where one life seems naturally meant to replace another. When the doctors said a transplant could give him a future, I felt something in me straighten, like a door opening to air that had been waiting years to be breathed. I volunteered for the test before Miranda could object. It wasn't defiance then, it was instinct. The months that followed were long but purposeful. Every appointment, every scan, every needle had a reason. I hadn't had a reason in a long time. The nurses treated me gently, almost reverently. Perhaps they sensed what I was doing without saying it aloud. I told no one at first, not even Jesse. I wanted the news to come as a surprise, something hopeful to lift him out of that gray half-life of dialysis and waiting rooms. I imagined the day they would tell him that his grandmother was the match, that she would give him what he needed. In that imagined moment, the family would gather again, not for holidays or obligations, but for gratitude. Instead, the morning of the surgery came like an ambush dressed as routine. I woke before dawn, packed a small bag with my robe and slippers, and took a taxi to the hospital. I remember watching the city crawl out of sleep, the streetlights blinking against the first thin line of daylight. The driver asked if I was visiting someone. I said no, not exactly. I didn't want to explain that I was on my way to give away a part of myself no one seemed to want anymore. At check-in, the nurse frowned at her screen and asked me to wait. There was a problem with the paperwork, she said. A few minutes later, Miranda arrived, breathless, immaculate, holding her phone like a weapon. The nurse's expression changed from confusion to discomfort. That's how I knew. My daughter had gotten there first. She had called the hospital, spoken to the administrator, and canceled the procedure under the guise of protecting me. I remember the smell of disinfectant, the echo of footsteps in the corridor, and Miranda's voice, so calm, so certain, explaining that I wasn't thinking clearly, that I was being emotional. I tried to argue, but every word felt like it belonged to someone else. The doctor, a kind-faced man with tired eyes, asked us to step aside. He spoke gently, perhaps too gently. "Let's all breathe," he said. But it was Miranda who exhaled, satisfied, as though a verdict had been announced in her favor. The paperwork, he explained, couldn't proceed without confirmation from the immediate family. Immediate family. I wanted to laugh. I had given birth to the very person who now declared me unreliable. After she left, after she had done what she came to do, I sat in the waiting area for a long time. I watched people come and go with their charts and wristbands, the steady choreography of those still considered worth saving. No one told me to leave, so I stayed until the daylight turned the linoleum floor to gold. Then the surgeon came, a tall man, younger than I expected, holding a clipboard like it carried something sacred. He looked around, as if making sure no one was listening. "Mrs. Anderson," he said softly, "your daughter doesn't know you were donating your kidney to her son." I felt the air leave the room, not from shock, but from the simplicity of the truth. All those months, all the secrecy, all the forms I'd signed with my own hand, none of it had reached her. She had canceled something she didn't even understand. The surgeon's voice was low, apologetic. He said he couldn't overrule her decision yet, but that my records showed remarkable health for my age. "You were cleared completely," he added, almost to himself. I nodded. I wasn't surprised. I'd spent a lifetime being told what I could and couldn't handle, and somehow I'd always outlived their predictions. I walked out of that hospital without my surgery, without the dignity of a patient, not even the courtesy of a signature on my own behalf. I walked out as something else, an afterthought in a system that prefers silence to resistance. Outside, the morning had already turned bright. The taxis lined the curb, engines idling. I didn't take one. I walked instead, slowly, letting the sun find my face. People passed me without noticing, just another old woman on her way to somewhere unimportant. But inside me, something stubborn began to move again, quiet but certain. It wasn't anger yet. It was the first breath of it, the kind that fills the lungs after a long season of holding still. That was the day my daughter decided I was too old to be useful, and I decided she was too young to understand the difference between protection and possession. I went home, made a cup of tea, and sat by the window until the light faded. I told myself I would rest, but rest doesn't come easily to women who have spent their lives being reasonable. And that's where this story begins, not with the surgery that didn't happen, but with the silence that did. Because sometimes the worst wounds are the ones politely explained away. When you spend decades raising a child, you imagine that the bond between you is made of something indestructible, that no matter how distant you become, the thread will hold. But I learned that morning that love, once translated into control, becomes a kind of weapon so polished it cuts without sound. In the days following the canceled surgery, the calls began. They came from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, from neighbors who suddenly remembered my birthday, from a distant aunt who thought she could mediate whatever misunderstanding had occurred. Their voices were syrupy with concern, each of them repeating the same phrase as if rehearsed. "Miranda told us everything. You shouldn't have been pressured like that." Pressured? By whom? I had volunteered. No one had coerced me. Yet somehow, In her retelling, I had become a frail, confused woman, manipulated by doctors, hungry for statistics, and a grandson too desperate to question. It was astonishing how quickly people accepted that version. I didn't know whether to be insulted or impressed by her efficiency. At first, I tried to correct them gently. I said it was my decision, that I had gone through every test and evaluation, that my doctors were confident. But the more I defended myself, the more they spoke in that tone reserved for children or the unwell, murmuring things like, "You've had a lot on your plate, dear," or, "Sometimes stress makes us think we're stronger than we are." It was like shouting into a padded room. My words sank without sound. Even Jesse stopped calling for a while. I understood. He was exhausted, bewildered, trying to make sense of a story that didn't align with the woman he knew. I pictured Miranda sitting beside him, her voice calm and rational, as she told him that I'd gotten cold feet, that it was better this way, that the guilt he felt was unnecessary because I'd been overly optimistic. I could almost hear her tone, sweet, patronizing, airtight. The truth is, Miranda has always needed to manage the world, to edit it until it matched her sense of order. When she was little, she used to reorganize her toy shelf after every play date, aligning the dolls by height and color. When her father died, she was 15 and spent the funeral rearranging the flower stands because she couldn't bear the disorder of grief. Control was her way of surviving. I understand that now, but understanding something doesn't mean excusing it. It doesn't heal the small deaths caused by being managed into invisibility. In the weeks that followed, my apartment became quieter than usual. The bakery downstairs hummed on, but I began to hear its rhythms differently. The clatter of trays sounded like accusations. The hiss of the coffee machine reminded me of whispered disapproval. I found myself narrating the past out loud just to prove it had really happened. "I was approved for surgery," I'd mutter while folding laundry. "I passed every test." Sometimes I'd stop mid-sentence, realizing I sounded like one of those women people cross the street to avoid. Maybe that's what they all wanted, to let me talk myself into discrediting my own memory. One afternoon, I received a letter from the hospital confirming that the procedure had been withdrawn by family representative. The phrase startled me. Family representative, as if I were a company whose assets required supervision. My hands trembled, not from anger, but from the sudden recognition that I had officially been erased from my own decision. The language was bureaucratic, bloodless, and final. The world had stamped me non-compliant in ink I couldn't wash off. I sat for a long time staring at the letterhead, the neat blue logo, the embossed seal of authority. Then I folded it once, slid it into an envelope, and wrote Miranda's address on the front. No note, no explanation, just her name. I wanted her to see what she had signed on my behalf, to see how perfectly the system had accepted her version of me. 3 days later, the envelope came back, unopened, stamped "Return to Sender." I don't know if she refused it or simply couldn't bear to look. Either way, the message was the same. She held all the keys and saw no reason to explain herself. That night, I dreamed I was standing in a long corridor lined with closed doors, each one labeled with someone else's permission. I woke before dawn and realized it wasn't a dream. It was just another Tuesday in my daughter's world. The true catalyst came quietly. A phone call from Jesse's nurse, a woman named Ellen, who had always spoken to me kindly, though never outside the boundaries of professionalism. That afternoon, her voice trembled as she told me Jesse had been asking questions about the canceled procedure, that he seemed confused and hurt. She didn't share details, Confidentiality, she said, but her tone carried a kind of coded plea. I thanked her, hung up, and sat for a long time at the kitchen table with my tea cooling in my hands. I knew then that silence was no longer kindness. It was complicity. I called Miranda that evening. She answered on the second ring, her voice clipped, already armed. I asked her if she had spoken to Jesse about the surgery. She said she had, that he needed clarity. I asked her what she had told him. The truth, she said, that you were being reckless, that it wasn't fair to put him through more worry. You think giving up a kidney makes you a saint, but it would have made you a statistic. I wanted to tell her that being a mother had already made me a statistic long before I learned the term geriatric donor. I wanted to ask her if she realized that taking away my choice had also taken away Jesse's hope. But she kept talking, her sentences smooth and decisive, the verbal equivalent of a closing door. You should be thanking me, she said. You don't need to prove anything anymore. When she hung up, I didn't call back. I just sat there listening to the dial tone, realizing that she truly believed she had saved me from myself. There's a peculiar pain in being loved like that, the kind that feels like being embalmed while you're still breathing. A week later, I returned to the hospital, not for treatment, but because I needed to stand in the place where my intention had been canceled. I walked the corridors like someone revisiting the scene of a crime, though I wasn't sure who the victim was anymore. In the waiting area, I saw the same nurse who had first checked me in. She recognized me and hesitated before approaching. Mrs. Anderson, she said softly, I'm so sorry about how things unfolded. Her eyes flicked toward the floor, then back to me. It happens more often than you'd think. I asked her what she meant, and she explained that sometimes families intervene, especially when the donor is older. They think they're protecting you, she said, but sometimes they're just afraid of losing control, afraid of guilt if something goes wrong. She lowered her voice. But medically, you were cleared. There was nothing in your file to justify a cancellation. I left without another word, but her comment burned like a hidden ember. That was the moment the story shifted from confusion to something sharper. It wasn't about health anymore. It was about ownership. Somewhere along the line, I had stopped being a mother and become a liability, a fragile relic to be preserved behind glass, admired for endurance, but denied the right to act. And that, I realized, was the real illness consuming this family. When I returned home that night, the bakery below was closing. The scent of warm bread floated through my window, sweet and heavy, a reminder of how something ordinary can turn sacred simply because it rises. I stood there for a long time, breathing it in, thinking of Jesse, thinking of the part of me that had been ready to rise in him. Miranda could cancel a surgery, but she couldn't cancel intention. She could rewrite the story, but not the truth that pulsed quietly beneath it. I had been willing, and that willingness still lived in me. It hadn't been removed. It was waiting, steady as a heartbeat, for the next breath of courage to bring it back to life. In the weeks that followed, nothing dramatic occurred, and that is exactly how the harm found its shape, not in slammed doors or shouted words, but in small corrections to the air around me, as if someone kept walking through the room, moving the furniture a quarter inch at a time so that I could never sit where I meant to without bumping my knee. Miranda did not call to apologize. She called to organize, her voice calm and managerial, while she rearranged the narrative so carefully that even I began to doubt where I had been standing. She told relatives there had been a medical mix-up and that I'd misunderstood certain instructions. She told friends at church that I was brave but confused and asked them to keep me in their prayers for clarity. She posted a photo of Jessie smiling weakly from a dialysis chair with a caption about the power of family decisions. And by the time I saw it, there were 100 little hearts and 24 comments praising her strength. My name did not appear. If I were to complain, it would sound petty, like I wanted credit for almost doing a hard thing. That is the genius of erasure. It turns protest into impoliteness. At home, the changes were quieter. A notice arrived from my clinic saying my online patient portal password had been reset because of a security request. I hadn't made one. When I called, the attendant explained that my authorized family contact had asked to help manage communications, and that, for my convenience, certain notifications would now go to Miranda. The woman on the line used the kind of gentle tone people reserve for skittish animals, the syllables softening as if they might bruise me. I hung up and made tea, then sat at the table and stared at the steam until it disappeared, wondering how many more small vanishings would be necessary before I stopped noticing them altogether. At the pharmacy, I discovered a new note on my file stating that certain medications should require verbal confirmation from a family member before refills. The pharmacist, a young man with kind eyes, looked embarrassed when he told me. He whispered that the system allowed it if a caregiver requested, and that it was usually helpful for seniors. And I said, I understood, because there was no point explaining that help which comes disguised as custody is just another kind of lock. I bought my vitamins for cash and walked home slowly, feeling the day tilt as though the street had acquired a slight slope that hadn't been there in the morning. By the time I reached my building, the bakery was letting its last pan of bread cool, and the scent lifted like a small mercy through the stairwell. I stood on the landing and breathed it in, as if the smell alone could remind me I was still a person with a kitchen and a stove, and a right to decide what my own hands would carry. Jesse called less. When he did, his sentences came trimmed, as if he had been advised to conserve energy or tact. He asked about the weather and my crossword and told me he was tired, that the doctors were adjusting his sessions, that he had to believe something would change soon. I said I believed it too, and then there would be a silence so long and careful that both of us could hear the choreography of it. Two people deciding which truth the other would survive. I sent him a soft cap I knitted in a color he used to like, and it came back a week later with a postal sticker that said forwarding expired. I knew he had not returned it, and yet the sight of the padded envelope with my own handwriting on it felt like a small door closing from the inside. Miranda's husband texted once to ask if I needed anything around the apartment, a shelf put up, or a light bulb changed. The politeness of it was almost worse than scorn, because it assumed I would be grateful for the kind of help that kept my life tidy while my choices were quietly repackaged for community consumption. I told him I was fine. He responded with a thumbs up and a note about a fundraiser Miranda was organizing for kidney health awareness, and I realized she had found a way to turn even my exclusion into a platform. There would be speeches and photographs and perhaps a small, tasteful plaque thanking donors who believed in responsible care, and guests would leave thinking they had witnessed love in action, while the person who had been willing to give flesh instead of money would not be mentioned by name because names make stories less convenient. The landlord called to say my daughter had stopped by to make sure you're safe up those stairs, and to ask whether the building had considered installing a handrail along the final flight. She had done it kindly, he said, and I agreed that kindness was her native language, though I did not add that fluency in a language can conceal all manner of intentions. Later that afternoon, I found a brochure on my doormat for an assisted living community on the edge of town, slipped in by a hand that had not bothered to knock. The cover showed a woman with hair the color of manufactured snow, laughing at a salad as if it had just told her a charming secret. I set the brochure on the counter and watched it while I cooked, as if it might move closer on its own, as if gravity could be trained to prefer me softened. Even the church, where I had once blended into the pews with my unremarkable coat and quiet hymns, began to feel curated. A woman from the prayer chain hugged me so long I could feel the shape of her pity, and when I pulled away, she held my forearms in both hands and said she knew aging was scary, but that surrender could also be holy. I smiled and said surrender had its place, though the thing inside me that refused to accept substitutions fluttered like a bird that had learned to fake sleep when the hand reached toward the cage. After the service, the pastor stopped me to say Miranda had shared her concerns about my stress and that I should consider speaking with the church counselor, who was excellent with family boundaries. I nodded again because disagreement in that foyer would have been perceived as instability, and then I walked home past the bakery, where the young barista had propped open the door to let the afternoon drift out across the sidewalk like a blessing given without paperwork. At night, I began to dream of small administrative tasks taking on the weight of fate. In one dream, I stood at a counter as a clerk, stamp declined on the word grandmother, while apologizing that the font I preferred was no longer supported. In another, I picked up a ringing phone that recited my birth date in a cheerful voice, and then informed me my autonomy points had been redeemed by a family account. I woke from these dreams with the taste of metal in my mouth and would sit at the table until the window bruised with dawn, watching the light arrive like something that used to be mine but now belonged to a neighborhood committee. The escalation was not only what they did, but what I stopped doing. I stopped telling stories where I was the actor because it seemed to worry people. I stopped walking to the far park because Miranda had once mentioned my hip when I stood up too quickly, and now the comment lived in the sidewalk like a lifted edge of concrete I might trip over. I stopped mentioning the surgery, except to the tea kettle and a plant that refused to thrive in my best window. I caught myself practicing sentences that would sound steady if anyone asked whether I had changed my mind by myself. No one asked. Small legal things appeared and multiplied. A form from the insurance company arrived requesting confirmation of my primary health advocate, a line already filled with Miranda's name in a tidy font that looked inevitable. In the margin, my own handwriting hesitated, then circled the word primary as if that would slow the ink. I put the form aside and brewed another cup of tea, the kind of postponement that presents itself as calm, when in truth it is a tremor. A week later, I found a voicemail from a financial advisor I had never met, cheerfully offering to review my estate plan to reduce stress for the family. He used my first name 3 times, a trick people use to simulate closeness where none exists. I deleted the message and felt briefly heroic, then thought of how softness accumulates the way snow does, covering every firm edge until you can no longer find the path you shoveled yesterday. On Jesse's birthday, I baked a small cake and wrapped it carefully, then realized there was nowhere to bring it that would not turn into a scene. Instead, I cut a slice for myself and ate it at the table without singing, tasting memory under the frosting, like a spice from a jar whose label had fallen off long ago. I wrote him a card I did not send, a simple paragraph about the day he was born and the sound he made that first hour, which I still hear sometimes when the bakery mixer starts on low. I told him I had wanted to give him something he would not have to outgrow. I placed the card beneath the plant that refused to thrive, a private offering to stubborn things. The nearest thing to a confrontation came packaged as a favor. Miranda invited me to a family planning meeting at her house on a Sunday afternoon, and when I arrived, the dining table was set with lemon water and legal pads, as if grief were a project with action items. She spoke about logistics and safety nets and asked if I would consider letting her handle my medical communications going forward, a phrase that implied both timeline and verdict. I told her I would consider nothing decided without me in the room, and she smiled the way a good salesperson smiles at a hesitant customer, not with anger, but with assurance that time would complete the sale. When I stood to leave, she hugged me too firmly and whispered that she knew I was trying to help, but that sometimes love means stepping back. I did not say that I had already stepped back, that I had been stepping back for months, that I could feel the wall behind me now, cool and smooth and inching closer. Walking home at dusk, I passed the bakery as the owner dragged 2 bags of flour inside and propped a mop against the door frame. The day's last heat leaked onto the sidewalk, smelling of yeast and effort. I thought of the first time Jesse stood on a kitchen chair to stir batter, his small hand hovering as if mixing required permission. All the way, I told him then, and he did, and the bowl swallowed the spoon with a sound that meant ingredients had committed to each other. Now I kept seeing that moment and wondering at the quiet reversal, how the people who had learned to stir from me had grown so certain that my hand must be guided or removed. That is how the first escalation worked, with no fire alarm, with no visible smoke, only the slow discipline of gentle voices building a scaffolding around me until my view narrowed to the space they preferred I inhabit. They called it care and safety and stewardship and planning. I called it a kind of winter that arrives in mild weather, tender and persuasive, convincing the leaves to drop before the cold has even earned them. And if anyone had asked whether there had been a turning point, a single moment when I realized I was being moved out of my own life, I would have said it was the instant I heard my kettle click off and did not rise, because I wanted to see how long the steam could linger once the heat was taken away. The first sign that something inside me was shifting came one ordinary morning when I caught my own reflection in the bakery window, and for the first time in months did not look away. The woman in the glass wasn't the one my daughter described to people, not fragile, not confused, not vanishing. She was simply tired of being rearranged. I remember thinking that the body can forget how to fight, but the soul keeps rehearsing. For weeks I had been living in a kind of polite fog, moving carefully so as not to confirm anyone's fears about me, answering phone calls with the small voice of someone grateful to be checked on. That morning I heard that voice and did not recognize it. I went upstairs, poured myself a cup of coffee stronger than I usually make, and sat at the table without rushing to fill the silence. It was in that long quiet that I began to understand that waiting for understanding from others was another way of agreeing to disappear. Later that week, I returned to the hospital, not to argue or reclaim anything, just to gather my records. The receptionist hesitated, surprised perhaps that someone my age would ask for paperwork rather than comfort. She printed the pages slowly, a stack of dates and numbers and test results that proved what I already knew. I was sound, capable, cleared. I thanked her, folded the documents into my purse, and walked out with the strange steadiness of a woman carrying invisible proof. No one stopped me, no one asked questions, and yet it felt like a small rebellion to stand upright in a place that had already written my name in past tense. On the bus ride home, I watched people scrolling through their phones, each face lit by its own small world. I thought of Miranda, how she had rewritten mine into something palatable, a story of noble surrender. She was probably telling it somewhere at that very moment, and I realized she would keep telling it until the world fit her narrative perfectly, but she could not tell it for me anymore. I took out the papers and looked at the hospital's seal pressed into the last page, the mark that once meant authority and now looked like permission reclaimed. I slipped them back into my bag and promised myself I would not let the file become another relic of defeat. That evening, I wrote in a notebook I had not touched since my husband died. The pages smelled faintly of cedar from the drawer where they had been hidden for years. I wrote about small things at first, the way the light in the hallway changed through the day, the sound of my upstairs neighbor's radio. And then, without planning to, I began writing about power, about how easily it transfers from those who stop noticing to those who never forget to claim it. I did not write Miranda's name, but she was in every line. I stayed up past midnight, words tumbling out like a confession no one would hear but me. When I finally stopped, the air in the room felt lighter, rearranged. Writing didn't fix anything, but it made the world solid again, measurable, mine. The next morning, I placed the notebook in my bag and went for a walk beyond the streets I usually stayed within. The city opened itself to me. Slow traffic, uneven sidewalks, the smell of rain on dust. I passed a community library tucked between two laundromats, a place I had walked by 100 times without seeing. On impulse, I went inside. The librarian, a man with thinning hair and a cardigan too big for him, looked up and smiled as if he had been waiting. I asked if they needed volunteers. He seemed startled, but pleased, and handed me a form. "Mostly shelving," he said, "a bit of catalog work." The simplicity of it felt like a lifeline. I filled it out on the spot, my handwriting deliberate and unshaken. When I left, the wind had picked up, scattering small leaves across the pavement, and for the first time in months I found myself walking into it instead of bracing against it. That afternoon I called Jesse. It took courage just to hear his voice, thin and polite at first, the voice of someone unsure which story was safe to believe. We talked about books, about a stray cat he had been feeding outside his apartment, and then the conversation faltered into honesty. "Grandma," he said, "I wish things hadn't gotten so strange." I told him that strangeness was just the world's way of reminding us we're alive. There was a long silence on the line, not awkward, just heavy with all the things neither of us could say without reopening wounds. When we hung up, I felt the tremor of something fragile rebuilding itself, one heartbeat at a time. In the days that followed, I began clearing my apartment, drawer by drawer, not out of bitterness, but because I wanted to see what truly belonged to me. I found letters from my husband, old recipes written in his hand, and the faded hospital brochure from the week Jesse was born. I kept the letters and threw away the rest. The act was strangely exhilarating, like pruning a tree and realizing how much sunlight had been waiting behind the overgrowth. My daughter had been pruning me for years, deciding which branches were too old to keep, but this time the shears were in my hand. Miranda called the following Sunday. She sounded bright, controlled, as if rehearsing good news. She said Jesse's doctors were hopeful for a new donor match and that everything was working out, her voice sliding over the words with that professional calm she wears like jewelry. I listened quietly, waiting for the faint tremor beneath her confidence. When she finally paused, I said I was happy for him and for her. Then gently, I added that I had picked up my own records from the hospital. The silence that followed was long and perfectly still, the kind of silence that rearranges a room. She cleared her throat and said, "You didn't need to do that, Mom. It's handled." I told her that nothing about my life was handled without me. She started to speak, then stopped, perhaps hearing for the first time that my voice no longer asked permission to exist. We ended the call politely. That politeness felt like armor. Afterward, I sat at the window with a notebook open, tracing the veins of a leaf I had pressed between its pages earlier that day. I thought about the word handled, how it implies care and control at once, how it turns a living thing into an object of management. For years, I had let myself be handled by expectations, by family, by the quiet narrative of being a good mother who doesn't cause scenes. Now the word felt foreign on my tongue, like a language I had unlearned. I wrote it down and crossed it out. Beneath it, I wrote another, choice. The librarian called to confirm my volunteer shift the next week. It was a small thing, a few hours of sorting books, but it gave me a structure that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. When I arrived, he showed me the back room filled with shelves that needed reordering. The scent of paper and dust was comforting, like time agreeing to be touched. I spent the afternoon alphabetizing titles, losing track of hours, and when I finally stepped outside, the sky was deep blue, the kind that seems to stretch farther when you've earned it. I walked home with tired legs, but a mind that felt newly arranged. That night, I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the sink, watching the streetlights blink on one by one. The bakery below was closing, the owner sweeping the last crumbs into a dustpan, and I realized that the world would continue whether or not I remained small enough to fit into other people's definitions. I wasn't cured of anything, not even anger, but I had remembered something essential, the difference between being still and being silenced. That difference was now the measure of every decision I would make. The midpoint of my story wasn't a grand revelation or a confrontation. It was the moment I began to act quietly in my own name, to write, to volunteer, to hold my records, to speak without trembling. It was the slow rediscovery of authorship. I had been a character in my daughter's narrative for too long, a patient, a mother, a cautionary tale. Now, sentence by sentence, I was writing myself back into existence. In the weeks after I began carrying my own file and writing in the cedar-scented notebook, the air around my life thickened again, not with the mushy pity of before, but with a cooler kind of pressure, like a hand pressing steadily at the small of the back to suggest a direction that is not a shove, and therefore can be argued later as care. The first sign was the envelope slid under my door without a knock, a smooth white rectangle with my name printed so neatly I knew immediately it had not been addressed by anyone who has ever needed to hurry. Inside was a letter on a legal letterhead that managed to sound tender and threatening at once, explaining that my daughter, out of an abundance of love, wished to explore options that would minimize decision fatigue, a phrase so tidy I could hear the conference room where it had been born. There was talk of streamlining communications, of designating a representative for medical consent contingencies, of a conversation with a court if clarity could not be reached. I read it twice, then folded it along the manufacturer's crease and placed it beside my teacup, where the steam dampened its edge as if the paper itself were learning to breathe. I did not call Miranda, not because I was afraid of the argument, but because I knew she would treat my anger like a scheduling conflict and propose a calendared solution. Instead, I walked to the community library, the little narrow building that had taken me in without questions, and asked the librarian if the back room was free. I sat among the donated dictionaries and wrote a statement in my own hand saying that no person, however loving, could sign my choices out from under me. I wrote it slowly, so each letter carried the weight of the years in which I had been easy to overrule. And when I finished, I felt the peculiar clarity that follows even small declarations made aloud to an empty room. The pressure did not announce itself only in letters. It arrived as a sequence of polite surprises. A woman from a city office came to my door with a clipboard and a smile so wide it felt like a sticker, explaining there had been a call expressing concern about a senior living alone, and would I mind answering a few questions for peace of mind. She was trained to be kind, and she did it well, but underneath the script, I could feel the machinery of doubt, humming and professional. I invited her in because I wanted the sunlight through my west window to bear witness, and we talked about my rent and my groceries and whether I could name the date and the mayor and the street outside, small tests dressed as conversation. When she asked if I had someone to help me advocate at medical appointments, I told her I had myself and that I had brought my own file home, at which point she took a breath, the little inhale bureaucrats learn to hide, and made a respectful note. Before she left, she glanced at the sewing basket by my chair and said her grandmother used to mend socks by the window too, and for a second we were simply two women talking about the art of keeping things from falling apart. Then she remembered her role. I remembered mine, and we shook hands as if a treaty had been signed between countries that will always prefer their own borders. At church, where the carpet remembers the steps of decades, the pastor's wife took me aside and, with the intimacy of shared casseroles, told me there was a kidney health fundraiser next month that Miranda had poured her heart into, and wouldn't it be healing for everyone if I attended and lit a candle for wise decisions. I pictured the small flame trembling, while the room applauded the story I did not agree to inhabit. I told her I would consider it, which is a sentence that looks like a bridge, but is more often a gate. On my way out, a woman from the pew behind touched my elbow to say she had heard I'd withdrawn from the surgery for my own safety, and that it was inspiring to see a mother choose life in such a responsible way. And I thought how easily narratives are blessed when they flatter our fear. In the afternoon, I sat at my table and opened the notebook and copied out a sentence my husband once said when our car broke down on a country road, and everyone who stopped wanted to give advice that involved him moving aside. The person who holds the jack keeps the car from crushing the person underneath. I wrote it again beneath that, smaller, as if the repetition could turn memory into a tool. Miranda did not appear in person. She appeared in systems, which is how power moves when it is confident of the ground it stands on. My pharmacy account reverted once more to shared notifications. The patient portal asked me, as a courtesy, to confirm that my designated contact should remain in place to improve outcomes, and when I unchecked the box, it repopulated on the next screen, as if the software itself had learned to insist on what the humans around it preferred. A nurse I liked called to say that scheduling was complicated, and perhaps future conversations would be simpler if I allowed my daughter to coordinate logistics. And when I said that complexity was not the enemy of truth, she was quiet for a moment, in the way people are when your grammar does not match the template of the form in front of them. In the quiet after these calls, I realized the most exhausting part of being doubted is not the proving. It is the slow compression of your days into a corridor where every step is measured against a hypothetical danger someone else insists they have seen from a vantage point they refuse to describe. Two things happened that pushed the pressure into open weather. The first was an article in the community section of a local paper, printed on the kind of gray newsprint that rubs off on your fingers, titled with a softness that still managed to be sharp. A careful portrait of a family's courage dealing with a complex medical situation in which a daughter learned to make difficult choices to protect her vulnerable mother. There was a photograph of Miranda holding a candle in a circle of people whose faces were blurred, and beneath it a caption about love doing the hard thing. They did not name me, which was worse than if they had, because anonymity is its own kind of indictment. It allows everyone to imagine the old woman exactly as helpless as they need her to be. The second was a visit to the library from Miranda herself, who arrived at the end of my shelving shift, looking polished and rested in a way I recognized as her armor, and asked if we might talk in the reading alcove where the light falls kindly. She sat with her knees together and her hands folded on an oversized tote that seemed to contain contingencies, and told me she was proud of me for getting involved at the library, and that it warmed her heart to see me finding outlets, and that she would hate to see me overwhelmed by paperwork when professionals could take that burden. I listened, watching the way she kept smoothing an invisible wrinkle along the seam of her skirt, and when she finished, I told her in a low voice that I would no longer permit my name to be used in any context that revised my choices, that she was not to speak to reporters or committees as if I were a distant problem, and that I had written and signed a statement of my own capacity and given copies to the librarian and to my neighbor downstairs, who knows who I am before 6 a.m., because she has seen me in curlers and still offers me the first loaf when the ovens run early. Miranda's eyes flashed with something that was not anger, exactly, but something like the alarm a pilot feels when a control that worked yesterday gives a different response today. She said softly that this confrontation was unnecessary because we both wanted the same thing, and I told her we did not, because I wanted a world in which people can love you without owning your future, and she wanted a world in which her fear could be mistaken for wisdom. The following Monday, I visited a legal aid clinic that operates out of a converted storefront with scuffed floors and waiting chairs that have held every kind of patient there is. A young attorney with ink on his fingers from a broken pen helped me put my statement into the correct shape, and then asked me, very gently, whether I wished to revoke any prior designations that might allow someone else to speak in my name when I was available to speak for myself. I said yes, and he nodded with the seriousness people reserve for acts that look small on paper but large in the soul. He suggested I keep several copies, and I did, tucking one behind the recipe card for the gingerbread my husband invented when we could not afford molasses and learned to improvise with honey and stubbornness. Walking home with the folder under my arm, I felt for the first time in months a quiet companionship with my own shadow, as if the part of me that had been waiting to be invited back into my decisions had finally matched my stride. The backlash did not wait. 2 days later, a second letter arrived from the same tidy firm, expressing disappointment that I had misunderstood the proposed guardianship conversation and suggesting a capacity evaluation to reassure all stakeholders. That word, stakeholders, rang through the kitchen like a clatter of dropped cutlery. I am not a project, I thought. I am the stake. That evening, as if orchestrated, a deacon from the church called to say that Miranda had been in tears after our library conversation, and that I should be gentle with her because she was carrying so much, and I thought of all the years I had carried so much without anyone calling to remind my daughter to be gentle with me. I thanked him for his concern and suggested gently that love which cannot tolerate a no is an appetite, and he changed the subject to the bake sale. Jessie reached out unexpectedly, a text that arrived while I was folding towels, asking if I had a moment to talk. When I called, his voice was the voice of someone trying to keep the edges of a story from fraying, tentative and adult at once. He told me he had seen the article and felt strange being celebrated by a narrative that left him out too, as if his body were a stage on which other people's virtues performed. He asked me, carefully, whether I had wanted to go through with everything, and I told him yes, and that I still wanted him to have a life large enough to choose his own mistakes, and that none of my wishes required him to be grateful on command. There was a long stretch of quiet, during which I could hear him breathing, and then he said he did not know whom to believe anymore, because both versions of events sounded like love, and I told him love can be measured by its willingness to step aside when the person it claims is ready to stand. He cried then, not loudly, not like a boy, but like a man who is tired and still somehow hopeful, and when we said goodbye, he said he would come by the library one afternoon soon. No plan, just a visit. And I said our lives already had too many plans. The week the fundraiser took place, Miranda sent a message saying there would be a reserved seat for me in the front row, and that the program would include a moment thanking seniors who know their limits. And I read it twice, tasting the sugar in the medicine, and then I replied that I would be busy that evening teaching the library's after-school group how to mend the torn page of a book with tape that doesn't yellow. She did not respond, which was its own kind of speech. That same day, a man in a gray suit stood outside the bakery when I returned from the post office and introduced himself as someone representing family interests, the phrase smooth as glass, and asked if we might discuss pathways to peace. We did not. I told him that peace without consent is a museum exhibit, and he blinked, but wrote something in his notebook, perhaps a descriptor he could invoice later. Then came the small, mean acts that never announced themselves as anything but efficiency. A package of vitamins I had ordered was redirected for review. My bank called to confirm that I really did mean to remove a secondary contact from my profile. The hospital sent a cheerful reminder that all pre-existing directives would be honored unless superseded by a more recent document, which was their way of reminding me that old signatures can be used like old maps to justify getting lost in the same places. I made tea and sat quietly after each of these, letting the heat travel through my hands the way a person steadies herself on railings that do not move even when the train lurches. The crescendo, if that's the word for it, came on a morning that smelled like rain, even though the sky held its water. The librarian handed me a manila envelope that had been left at the desk with my name on it, and inside was a copy of the hospital ethics policy highlighted in careful strokes, along with a handwritten note from a doctor I barely knew who had been present on the day everything was canceled. He wrote that he could not intervene in family matters, but wanted me to know that in cases where a competent adult's consent is clear, procedure should follow that consent, and that any departure from that standard was not medicine, but management. He added, in smaller script, that if I wished to file a formal complaint, there were channels, and that sometimes the existence of a record is its own kind of guardrail. I read the note twice and felt the steadiness that comes when someone unrelated to the blood drama of your family quietly says, "I see the shape of this, and you are not imagining the weight." That afternoon, Miranda appeared on the sidewalk outside the library, not alone this time, but with a woman I recognized as her friend from church who has a talent for carrying clipboards. They waited until my shift ended, then fell into step beside me in the practice choreography of people who want to seem incidental while conducting business. Miranda spoke first, her voice low, telling me that she had heard I was engaging systems and that she wished I would simply trust her to keep me safe, and that it hurt to be treated as the enemy when she was only trying to prevent disaster. I stopped on the corner where the bakery smell turned sweet around 4 o'clock and told her that disaster is what happens when people convince themselves that love is a better judge than the person living the life, and that safety, which erases agency, is a soft-spoken cousin of harm. The clipboard friend jumped in, suggesting we find a middle, and I said the middle of ownership and freedom is still a cage with a friendly latch. We stood there a long time, 3 women in the middle of an ordinary day, and I realized then the escalation had done its work, because my heart was steady, even as theirs beat fast enough to count in the hollow of the pause between words. That night I wrote 3 letters, one to the hospital, laying out the sequence of events without adjectives, just dates and choices and interferences, a cool thread I hoped would be strong enough to pull the needle through cloth. One to the legal aid clinic, enclosing copies of the documents I had signed, asking them to keep a file, not because I expected courtrooms, but because paper has a way of reminding the future who the past tried to be. And one to Jesse, not mailed, not yet, a letter that said I would not fight his mother in front of him, but I would not move out of the way of my own life either, and that if he wanted the truth, he could have it, but not as a weapon, only as a light. I sealed 2 envelopes and placed the 3rd beneath the cedar-scented notebook, and then I sat by the window until the streetlights made the glass a mirror. The woman who looked back at me was not triumphant and not broken. She was someone who had learned the difference between being guided and being steered, and who had decided she would no longer let anyone take her by the shoulders, however gently, and place her in a position that made their fear feel like wisdom. The next morning, as if summoned by whatever current had begun to move beneath the surface of our family, Jesse appeared at the door of the library with a cap pulled low and that patient half-smile of his that no illness had been able to take. He did not rush to hug me. He asked if we could walk, and we did, past the bakery and the bus stop and the lamppost where the paint peels like old wallpaper. He told me he was tired of being the reason everyone was so certain about everything that he wanted to hear my version from my own mouth, that he did not know whether any of it would change what needed to happen, but he could not carry a story that treated his life as a stage for other people's righteousness. We sat on a bench, and I told him the truth plainly about the tests and the approvals and the mourning that was taken from me before it began, about how love sometimes narrows when it is frightened and calls that narrowing wisdom, about how I was learning to widen again, even if it meant being called irresponsible in rooms where I was not invited. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he did not make promises. He only said softly that he felt a little less alone, and that feeling is not a cure, but it is a beginning. As we rose, I knew the second escalation had delivered what it always delivers when you refuse to vanish. Not victory, not yet, but witnesses, a doctor's quiet note, a young attorney's ink-stained competence, a grandson's steadiness, and that those, gathered together, might prove to be enough to carry us toward the next necessary act, the one that would not be polite and would not be quiet, but would, at last, belong unmistakably to me. The morning everything turned at last was an ordinary one, gray light caught between rain and sun, the kind of indecisive weather that can make a person feel suspended between what was and what is still possible. I woke earlier than usual before the bakery began its first batch, and the quiet of the apartment felt like a question waiting to be answered. On the table lay the notebook, the stack of papers, and the letter from the hospital that I had never filed, all of them breathing in the same faint draft from the window. For weeks I had been circling my own courage like a skittish animal, but that morning something inside me stopped circling. I brewed coffee strong enough to taste like intention, sat down, and began to sign my name on the complaints and statements I had written, one after another, deliberate and unhurried. Each signature was a sentence in a language I had almost forgotten how to speak. I consent. I revoke. I claim. I am. By the time the light reached the far wall, I had stacked the documents neatly and tied them with a red ribbon from an old Christmas box, because even rebellion deserves ceremony. I dressed simply, put on my coat, and walked to the post office. The woman behind the counter recognized me, she always does, and asked if I wanted insurance on the envelopes. I smiled and said they were already insured by the truth. She laughed without understanding, stamped the packages, and slid them into the outgoing tray. Watching them disappear behind the metal lip of the chute gave me a sense of calm I hadn't felt since before the word permission began haunting my days. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I walked to the river, a narrow stretch of water the color of pewter that winds behind the library, and stood there long enough to feel the wind press against my face. I thought of Miranda, of the years when her hand was small in mine, and she used to ask endless questions about what she could do when she grew up. I thought of the day she told me she wanted to work in a field where she could fix people's problems, and how proud I was of that instinct before I understood what happens when love forgets to ask for consent. I whispered a kind of prayer, not for forgiveness, not even for reconciliation, but for balance, for a future where neither of us would need to hold the other hostage in the name of care. When I returned to the library that afternoon, the librarian was waiting with an envelope of his own. It was the reply from the hospital's ethics board, acknowledging receipt of my complaint and confirming an investigation. The language was cautious, formal, but beneath it, I could feel an undercurrent of recognition. The system had heard my voice. It was not victory, but it was record, and record is the seed of history. I thanked him and slipped the letter into my bag. I did not tell him that I had sent copies elsewhere, to the legal clinic, to a patient rights office, to a journalist who had once written about elder consent. The truth no longer belonged to the private world of whispers. It needed to breathe in daylight. 2 days later, Miranda came to my door unannounced, her face pale from a kind of sleeplessness that no amount of discipline can hide. She said she had received calls from people asking difficult questions, that it was humiliating, that she wished I had come to her first. I told her I had, many times, but she had been busy speaking for me instead of to me. She stood in the doorway, arms folded, the same posture she had taken in that hospital hallway months ago. But this time, the power had shifted. The silence between us stretched, neither of us willing to break it with apologies that would only reset the old hierarchy. Then, unexpectedly, she said Jesse wanted to see me. For a moment, I thought she was using him as another argument, but there was something soft in her tone, a small surrender disguised as logistics. I told her I would come. When I arrived at Jesse's apartment, he opened the door himself, thinner but steadier, with that careful gentleness that comes from having been too close to endings. He hugged me first, a quiet, honest gesture that needed no permission slips. We sat at his kitchen table, the same age-worn surface where he had once spilled cereal and apologized with wide eyes. He told me he had learned the truth, that he had read the documents I sent, that the surgeon had confirmed everything. He said he didn't know how to reconcile his love for both of us, that Miranda was furious and afraid, but that he was tired of being the excuse for silence. I told him he didn't have to reconcile anything. He only had to live truthfully. Then he did something I didn't expect. He took my hand and asked if I still wanted to go through with everything I had once planned. I looked at him and saw the man he had become, not the patient or the boy, but the continuation of every choice that had brought me here. I said yes, but not for redemption, for peace. I told him that giving part of myself had never been about saving anyone's life. It was about proving that love without ownership is still power. He nodded, tears quiet but unashamed, and said, "Then let's do it right this time." What followed was not dramatic. There were meetings, calls, verifications, the unglamorous machinery of bureaucracy slowly turning toward justice. Miranda tried to interfere again, but this time she was met with signed statements, recorded calls, a paper trail that outlasted her explanations. She cried, begged me to reconsider, said she couldn't lose both of us, and I told her she had already lost the right to decide what loss meant for me. I didn't say it cruelly. I said it the way one says a fact that has waited too long to be spoken. The day before the new operation was scheduled, I walked through my apartment touching everything I owned: the worn teacup, the threadbare quilt, the photograph of my husband holding Miranda as a baby. Each object felt like a witness, and I thanked them silently for staying with me through the shrinking of my world, and now its slow expansion. I packed a small bag, the same one I had prepared before the first cancellation, and placed inside it a fresh notebook and a single fountain pen. On the first page I wrote, "Today, no one speaks for me." When I arrived at the hospital the next morning, the air smelled of antiseptic and renewal. The same nurse from months ago greeted me, her expression different now, not pitying, but respectful. The surgeon met me in the corridor, the same tall man with the clipboard, and said quietly, "Mrs. Anderson, everything is in order this time." I nodded, and he added, almost reverently, "Your daughter doesn't know what strength looks like until she sees it stand." That line stayed with me as I changed into the gown and lay beneath the bright light. I felt no fear, only the profound calm that comes when a person stops negotiating her own existence. I will not describe what happened afterward. That belongs to the private territory of the body, and it is enough to say that I woke to the sound of steady breathing, Jesse's, and to the sight of Miranda standing at the foot of the bed, eyes swollen, hands clasped, as if unsure whether prayer or apology would reach me first. I closed my eyes again, not to shut her out, but to hold the moment before it was interpreted by anyone else. For the first time in years, silence did not mean defeat. It meant ownership. In the days that followed, recovery felt less like healing and more like translation, turning pain into proof that I was still capable of giving shape to my choices. The nurses moved gently around me, and each small act, sipping water, walking a few steps, signing a discharge form, felt like punctuation in a long-delayed declaration of independence. Miranda visited, awkward and subdued, leaving flowers that smelled faintly of surrender. We didn't argue. We spoke about ordinary things, the bakery downstairs, the weather, Jessie's slow but steady improvement. It was a fragile peace, but a real one. She had begun, perhaps, to understand that protecting someone does not mean possessing their narrative. When they wheeled me out into the sun, I realized that everything I had done, every signature, every letter, every quiet refusal to vanish, had been less about a single operation and more about reclaiming authorship over the rest of my life. I thought of all the women who sit silently while their stories are revised by louder voices, and I whispered to them across the wind, "You can still choose." The nurse asked if I had said something, and I smiled, saying it was just a prayer of gratitude. But it wasn't gratitude alone. It was the final confirmation that the power I had searched for was never taken from me. It had only been waiting for me to say yes to myself. After the long storm of documents, arguments, and the cold air of hospital corridors, life returned to me slowly, not as a triumph, but as a steady rhythm. Recovery, they call it, though what I was recovering had less to do with flesh and more to do with ownership. I spent the first weeks at home, moving through rooms that now seemed larger, not because they had changed in size, but because they no longer contained anyone else's permissions. The bakery below resumed its morning percussion of trays and voices, and I would listen from my chair by the window, feeling the sound of ordinary work vibrate through the floorboards like a pulse that kept time with my own. It was the first rhythm in years that belonged entirely to the present moment. Miranda came by once a week, always careful, like someone approaching a dog she once scolded too harshly and now wishes to pet without being bitten. She brought groceries, arranged flowers, and spoke in a tone that had lost its managerial brightness. I could see the fatigue in her gestures, the way control had worn her down more efficiently than any illness could have. Sometimes she apologized without using the word, offering stories from her childhood as if to remind us both of when love had been simple. I let her talk. I had no need to win. Survival had already declared its quiet victory. When she left, I found myself wishing her peace, not penance. The years are too short to crave revenge from your own blood. Jesse visited often. His steps on the stairs became the most anticipated sound of my week. He brought books, music, and the kind of gentle mischief that reminds a house it is still alive. We never spoke much about the operation. The subject sat between us like a stone we both knew by shape, but no longer needed to lift. He would read aloud sometimes while I sewed, his voice filling the room with chapters about voyages, discovery, and people who found freedom only after being declared lost. One evening, he stopped mid-sentence and said, almost to himself, that he finally understood what strength looks like. I pretended not to hear, but the warmth in my chest lasted all night. The letters from the hospital and the legal offices arrived one by one, confirming closure. No one apologized outright, but the bureaucratic language softened, paragraphs blooming with phrases like recognized authority and affirmed decision. It was strange how comfort could come wrapped in paper that smelled of toner and policy. I kept the final letter in a folder under the notebook, both artifacts of the same lesson, that written words are what remain when spoken ones are doubted. Sometimes I take the file out and hold it, not as evidence against anyone, but as proof that silence can, with enough persistence, learn to sign its own name. Autumn arrived early that year. The trees along the river turned the color of rust and honey, and the air carried a smell of endings that felt merciful rather than sad. I resumed my volunteer hours at the library, shelving returns and mending torn covers. The librarian, who had quietly witnessed more of my struggle than most, began leaving small notes of encouragement between the pages of returned novels. "Keep writing," one said, and so I did. I began to fill new notebooks, not with complaint or confession, but with memory, with fragments of the ordinary that I had once been too busy surviving to notice. The way the morning light bends across a cup of tea, the sound of shoes drying near a heater, the sweetness of exhaustion earned by doing something that matters only to you. Sometimes, in the late afternoons, I walk by the river where I once stood after posting the letters. I watch the water's surface shift from dull gray to sudden brilliance when the sun finds it, and I think of how life does that too. Dull, then bright, then dull again, each change honest in its own time. I do not wait for miracles anymore. I practice steadiness instead. There is a kind of holiness in small continuities. Miranda and I are still learning the new grammar of each other. We speak without interruption now, and sometimes, when she forgets to perform certainty, her face softens back into the girl who once asked me if love ever ends. I told her then that it doesn't. It only changes verbs. She is beginning to believe me. Last week she brought me a plant for the windowsill, a green survivor that thrives on neglect, and I took it as her quiet way of saying she has begun to understand the difference between care and control. At night, before sleep, I write short messages in the margins of my journal, not to my daughter or grandson, but to women I will never meet, the invisible congregation of those who have been told they are too old, too fragile, too late. I tell them what I have learned in words, as plain as I can make them, that autonomy is not rebellion, that kindness is not submission, that love is not proven by surrendering your will. I tell them that it is never too late to rewrite even the last chapter, because the act of writing itself changes the ending. And when I finish, I set the pen down, close the notebook, and sit in the dark for a while, listening to the bakery's late machines hum beneath me. Somewhere below, a young worker is wiping down a counter, unaware that his ordinary rhythm is keeping time with the heartbeat of an old woman upstairs who finally learned how to belong to herself. I think of that as grace, not the divine kind, but the human one, the grace of continuance, of still being here to feel the night settle like a shawl across my shoulders. That is how my story ends, not with forgiveness offered or denied, not with the world suddenly just, but with the quiet knowledge that I have stepped back into my own name, and it fits. The room around me holds its breath. The clock moves, the city sighs, and I understand that peace is not the absence of noise. It is the ability to choose which sounds to let in.